So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. My colleague Piaget is going to start us off with talking about the basics of pulse field ablation, fundamentals of PFA, and highlights of energy differences. Pierre?
Thank you very much, Vivek. And enjoy your dinner while I work. I've been assigned with this difficult task to present you some of the rationale and basics of electroporation. As Vivek used to say, it's not magic, but we probably don't understand it all. It's really fascinating, though. It's important to keep in mind that the cells, and particularly the cardiac cells, are, of course, having a membrane, that is made of a bilayer lipidic structure with some hydrophilic polarized end that is facing the external milieu and also the internal aspect of the cell. And if you apply an electric field as shown on the left panel of this slide to a tissue, it will create some rearrangement in the bilayer membrane of the cell so that some pores are happening. I'll see. So very good. This will open some pores in the cells, and these pores may be of various size, and based on the size, they will be permanent or not. And so if they are not permanent, it leads to reversible electroporation. And if they are big enough, they will stay, and it's irreversible, and the cell will die. So the field that is applied to tissue, it shouldn't probably be seen as a straight line. There are some distortions in the field that will depend on several factors. This is showing you the impact of the duration of the pulse that are sent to the tissue. And so with this given waveform, which is pretty crude, with 0.5 milliseconds, you have nothing happening. Now, you can have big pores with less than that duration, but with a different type of waveform and possibly amplitude. And then with 3 milliseconds in this example, you start to see some small pores that will not stay. And then with 40 milliseconds, you have big pores leading to irreversible electroporation. So again, when the pores are stable, the cell will die because it cannot maintain its homeostasis, and so it dies. But the tissue integrity is perfectly preserved because the extracellular matrix is not impacted by its energy. And the inflammation, therefore, is kind of minimized as compared to what we know with the thermal energies we are using currently to perform cardiac ablations. And what I think is really important is that in essence, electroporation is non-thermal, which means that there are no retractile scar to happen, unlike what is observed with RF and to some extent as well with cryo. So it probably can reduce the risk for stiff LA syndrome. Having said that, I don't think that even with electroporation, it would be a good thing to kill every single cells in the left atrium to get rid of atrial fibrillation. It shouldn't be an excuse for that. But so this slice of tissue shows you the preservation of the matrix and collagen tissue from samples that we've been working on in the context of animal studies. So the myocytes the myocytes are dead, but the structure is preserved. So in a given tissue type for a given pulse waveform, there is a required electric field value threshold to be reached to create this irreversible electroporation. So this is a very important concept to have in mind. You have to reach a certain value for this electric field to obtain what you want, which is these big permanent holes in the membrane cell. And so the cells that are going to be exposed to enough magnitude of this electric field will die, and those who will have been exposed to an electric field value that is less than the threshold will survive. They will have reversible electroporation. And the very interesting thing with electroporation is that not all the cells are having the same sensitivity to the electric field. And because of that, there is some tissue selectivity. And for example, the myocytes are way easier to kill than the nerves. And it's, of course, much to our advantage when it comes to cardiac ablation. And so this is showing you a right phrenic nerve that was immediately adjacent to some deliveries in this animal in the right atrium. Particularly in the swine, it's really right next to the lesion, and the histologic aspect and the functional aspect were completely preserved in this animal. Interestingly enough, the vessels are also completely preserved and unaffected by the level of electric field that you need to have to kill the myocytes. And it's somehow visible on this MRI that is from one of our patients in Bordeaux, where on the right side you have the aspect with electroporation, and you can see that we have a very dense and homogeneous late guide enhancement around the pulmonary veins. And this is something you will not see with RF or with cryo. It's much more heterogeneous. And on cryo, this is one cryo patient we did at the same time in my center. And so you see the lesion, the bright late guide enhancement as well. But two things are interesting here. The first one is that you have some black areas here that are due to no reflow or hemorrhage. So either way, it means that some vessels in the atrial wall have been destroyed by the electric field. And this is not visible, and we never saw it in the 8 cases we did in Bordeaux with the electroporation. So really the vessels are preserved. And the esophagus here is showing a very significant late guide enhancement. With electroporation, we've never seen that happening. So these are interesting patterns that confirm the theory that, yes, you can fine-tune your delivery so that you will only impact cardiomyocytes. And so this is showing you a schematic of a catheter in contact with the myocardium. And this here highlights the area where the electric field threshold is reached, and within this area all the myocytes are going to be destroyed, and everything that is below this limit is extracardiac. And so the good thing is that even if we overpower our delivery and have the electric field threshold for myocytes exceeding the cardiac wall, we know that the esophagus and the nerves are going to be spared. So for the first time in the field of cardiac ablation, we can overpower our deliveries and yet not compromise safety. There are different ways to deliver this energy, and I think everyone has started with some unipolar or monopolar delivery. So from the electrode to a reference patch on the skin of the animal or patient. And this, of course, will involve a lot of muscles in the way and a lot of contractions. And this is pretty much what happens during a DC shock or DC ablation, and you see the patient jumping on the table. And so this is unpleasant, requires general anesthesia and possibly paralytic agents. But if you move to bipolar, then the energy is delivered between electrodes in the heart, and you do not have this muscle engagement. Or I should say that you can refine your energy and waveform so that you don't see it. And the patients at the present time are treated both in Prague and Bordeaux without general anesthesia and just boluses of propofol and no paralytic agents. There are tons of possible waveforms that you can think about, and this is where the complexity really starts. So this is a basic design for monophasic waveforms. These are biphasic. This is the typical AC current, not to be used really in this context. This is a typical defibrillation waveform, also used for some DC type of ablation. The duration is in milliseconds, typically between 6 and 20 milliseconds. And then you can have groups of pulses and groups of groups that are repeated over the delivery. And all these parameters are going to impact your electric field and are going to impact whether or not you reach irreversible electroporation. So it's a little bit like MRI sequences. It's very complex, and based on the recipe you get very different results and consequences on the tissue. And so these are examples that have been published of unbalanced biphasic pulses. These ones are balanced through the groups. Now, there are several basic elements that are probably interesting to know. The transmembrane voltage that we induce by applying this electric field to cells varies with the radius of the cells. And the important consequence of that is that smaller cells require a higher electric field to induce the same transmembrane voltage. So it's easier to work with bigger cells. And this may have some consequences when the cells are not spherical, of course. This is showing you the area that will receive the largest amount of the electric field and the largest transmembrane voltage. This is showing you the same in fluorescence. And if you wait just a little longer, this other side of the cell will look as this one. So these models are simplified, but they help understanding a little bit how it works. The angle here also plays a role, and this is why you have more impact on these aspects of the cells as compared to the poles. There are also some variations according to the frequency of the pulses. So smaller pulses or higher frequency require a higher electric field amplitude to induce the same transmembrane voltage. So this is important because there are some interest in having higher frequency and some benefit for using them, but it requires some adjustments in the voltage that are applied to maintain the same efficacy, if you will. So again, this type of waveform can be used, but you definitely have very different impact as compared to more refined and dedicated pulse field type of waveform. So long high voltage pulses, generally speaking, can result in arcing and large bubbles or vapor. This is certainly attenuated, if not completely controlled, by ultra short voltage pulses in the range of microseconds. Excuse me. The pulses that we initially worked were typically generated as high energy defibrillator pulses, but again, with different parameters, you can completely eliminate the arcing phenomena that are not good because they make the lesion kind of unpredictable and possibly at risk. Of course, bubbles are not desirable, and you can refine the waveform to minimize them. With the old type of waveform, there is also a higher sensitivity to the electrode geometry and placement that is more forgiving with more recent strategies. It, of course, requires, and this is where the group of engineers from FirePulse have been working so hard for the last, I think, 7 years. It requires to build a specific generator, and this is not an easy task, obviously. But because of that, you can get much more controlled lesions with much less risk for complications. This is showing you the impact of the duration of the pulses you are delivering and the voltage you are delivering. Typically, it's very much linked, and if you increase the duration, you will increase the efficacy, of course, with some caveats to that. If you increase the voltage, you will also increase the efficacy, but also with some caveat to that. And interestingly enough, this area here that is relatively unexplored is where we found the most benefits. So we're working with pulses in the range of microseconds and with fields that are applied that remains reasonable and manageable, but still we can achieve irreversible electroporation with these values. And so this is showing you the different thresholds for different type of cells. And well, sometimes in life you get lucky and you see that the myocardial cells are those who are having the highest sensitivity to this energy. The red blood cells, smooth muscle, endothelium and nerves are requiring 4 times higher energies to 9 times higher energies to get some irreversible electroporation. So it's important to remember, though, that the actual electric field threshold for a given tissue depends on the specific waveform used. And so it's not just about the voltage or the duration. The voltage is certainly the major predictor, but there are other aspects here that matter much. And so these values are from the literature, and they are not necessarily directly applicable to what we're doing now, because they've been achieved with monophasic waveforms that were pretty simple. But altogether, it remains true, and the factors of difference are still preserved. It's also important to remember that for a given pulse width, biphasic thresholds are generally larger than monophasic ones, generally by 50% or more. It means that if you want to use biphasic, which has a lot of advantages, you have to increase the voltage to compensate for that. Among the factors that are influencing the electroporation are the waveform details, so the pulse widths, but also the number of pulses, the time interval between pulses, the grouping of pulses, etc. This is where it looks like an MRI sequence. The electric field magnitude, of course, at a given location, the field orientation relative to the cell orientation, and the type of tissue, which is a major parameter, which is, of course, playing in our advantage in this particular case. And the local electric field itself is determined by the applied voltage and the details of the electrogeometry and, of course, the tissue properties. And, for example, fat remains a challenge even with electroporation. It's less sensitive to fat than RF is, for example, I think. But this would be a problem for epicardial deliveries. It is not for endocardial deliveries. But it just means that in addition to the work that has been done on the generator, there is also some work to be done on the catheter, because the electrogeometry is an important predictor for the electric field. And so, as said before, Farapulse has developed both the catheter and the generator. It took them years to get there, but it's pretty solid now. And the only thing that we can tune on the generator is the voltage. And these are different catheters that have been used to deliver electroporation. This is the one we are currently using. This is the one that the group of Carstenhaven and Fred Whitkampf is using with Abbott. This is the good old diagnostic type of catheter that we were using 25 years ago with DC ablation, and this is the PVAC by Medtronic. And I just would like to run some simulations because I think it's really interesting. This is again the Farapulse catheter. This is a simulation of a pulmonary vein, and you see that in this case we get a pretty large lesion at the ostium of the vein, it's pretty robust to some off-axis deployment of the catheter. Here with 30 degrees, we still maintain a nice circular lesion. It's pretty robust to lack of contact as well, as long as the gap is not too big with the tissue. 1 or 2 millimeters would still give you a very good lesion as shown here. This is 30 degree off-axis with a 2 millimeter gap, and yet you have on your simulation a completely circumferential lesion. You can also play with the deployment of the basket catheter into a basket configuration or a flower configuration, and both are providing some nice lesions here. These are simulations we've been running with a different type of catheter. See, the lesion looks smaller, and this is with a 10-pole catheter, where with 1 kV we've got some gaps between the electrodes, and by increasing the power, it's a little better, but still a gap between 110 would persist. Even with, if we were to decrease the threshold by 50%. I'm almost done. This is just to remind you that this is very different from RF and cryo. It's non-thermal, and we've seen some of the consequences before. The amount of energy that is delivered by applications is much less than what is delivered using RF. You can see the numbers here. Again, there is no thermal coagulation, no damage to the extracellular matrix. Nerves and bloods are spared. And can you run that video, please? This is showing you one of the patients we did in Bordeaux, thank you, with the nice circumferential lesions around the veins at the late guide enhancement MRI. And so I'd like to thank you for your attention.